Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about something called the phosphorus cycle. Now this is new for the A-level specification, for certainly for AQA, but potentially for others. Normally you look at the carbon cycle and the nitrogen, but in this video we're going to talk about the phosphorus cycle specifically. Now the phosphorus cycle is really interesting because if you were to ask students, as I do, where would you find phosphorus? What would you know about phosphorus? It seems quite a tricky question on the face of it. You wouldn't think specifically where have you seen phosphorus before, just in itself. But in fact, if you think about it, it's used or it's spoke about in most lessons. When you think about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, a source of phosphorus, ADP, the P again, phosphorus is found in DNA, it's found in RNA, so genetic material. It's found in phospholipids. So when we think about the type of fat that makes up a cell membrane, for example, phosphorus is part of that. Why is it important? Well, it's needed in muscle contraction, and I talk about that a bit more detail in the lesson or the video tutorials on muscles and the sliding filament theory. It's involved in nerve signaling. It's involved in metabolic pathways. Calcium phosphate is actually found in bone and teeth, and it actually helps control enzyme reactions. So you can see phosphorus really is quite essential. So let's start straight away with, so if those of you who have watched my videos on the carbon nitrogen cycle will have seen the quality of my drawings here, but so forgive my slightly crude sketches. So we're just going to have some grass. A little bit of grass to represent a field over here. We're going to then put in place a sort of river or stream, so this will represent water. I know it's a very crude image, but I like to draw it like this just because for me it really helps taking this step by step. And then we're going to add over to the side here just some rocks. Just give it a little bit of shading here just to make it look a little bit more authentic. So some rocky mountainous area if you like. There we go, just very simple. Very simple. We've got rocky area, some water source, and a field that's ultimately in this picture. But this simple drawing will allow us to kind of put everything in place. And our starting point here is the phosphate in the rocks. So we're just going to write phosphate in rocks. That's a source of phosphate. Now, dissolved phosphate ions in the form of PO4 actually make its way into oceans, lakes and soils through a variety of processes, through weathering, erosion and the use of fertilizers. So what we're going to do is we're just going to put an arrow to represent the movement of phosphorus ultimately, and I said that it would pass into the oceans through weathering. So in red, what we'll do is run all the names of the processes through weathering, erosion, and I said the use of fertilizers. And what that does is ultimately put phosphate, or dissolved, phosphate ions, and we'll put the chemical symbol, for those that want it, PO4 in oceans. And that's meant to be represented by my water here, lakes, but also to soils. So there's our first kind of stage in the phosphorus cycle. Now, if that were to go the other way, if we were to ultimately have those phosphate ions be assimilated into the rocks, and that is possible, then we can give a separate name to that entire process, and that process is known as sedimentation. So we'll just put that in there. So through weathering, erosion and use of fertilisers, phosphorus can move from the rock ultimately into waterways and back through a process known as sedimentation. Let's talk about plants. So we need to put a plant into this picture here. So we'll just very simple sketch here. Make it look a little bit more decorative. So we've got a little bit of plant there. Now what we find is that these dissolved phosphate ions can actually be absorbed into the plant. They could be incorporated into the plant. So we've now got an arrow moving to the plant. And as we've said, phosphorus, or more specifically, phosphate ions, are now in the plants, and they're incorporated into what's known as the biomass. So that process, if we were to name it in red again, that process would be absorption. Put that one in place there. So now we've had some of those dissolved phosphate ions being absorbed into the plant. Now those phosphorus or phosphate ions, ultimately a source of phosphorus, can pass to animals. So we're going to need an animal. Now this is where my drawing takes on a slightly peculiar look. I'm just going to draw my version of a cow here. It's not the best, but we'll go with that. I'll try and give it a little bit of shading here, just to make it look a little bit more realistic, even though it looks. There we go, there's my cow. Now ultimately, the reason why I'm putting this animal in is to just represent this arrow here. What ultimately is the process of feeding, because then what we have is phosphate ions in animals. And we can see how we continue the cycle here. So we've moved from phosphate ions in the plants now to phosphate ions in the actual animals. Now, through excretion, and more specifically excretion and decomposition, we extend this cycle. So if we were to talk about excretion, we could put this arrow in place here, because through the process of excretion, we release some of these phosphate ions, or this source of phosphorus. But equally, if we think about wastes and remains, then there is also a source of phosphate ion in that. So phosphate ions in wastes and remains, such as something called guano, which comes from seabirds and bones and shells. So what we're going to have here is we'll just have, just down at the bottom, just a pile of waste, just a very rough it's just to represent waste and remains. And this process, once again, is called excretion, but this is excretion and decomposition. And what we end up with is ultimately phosphate ions again, so let's put these in here. In waste and also in remains. So we think of guano from seabirds, bones and shells. Now, if we were to have erosion of that, erosion of these sort of remains, once again we've got another link back here to these phosphate ions either being in ocean lakes or soils, because erosion of that material would ultimately pass into either a waterway or into the soil. So what we've got here is this cycle almost coming full circle through what's called erosion. But equally, we can get those phosphate ions in the waste and remain to become assimilated or part of the phosphate in rocks. So what we have is a connection that runs all the way back to the beginning in a process known as deposition. So there we've got a little bit of information. In fact, let's just shrink the screen a little bit more just to get all of this in. There we go. So what we've had is phosphate in the rock that through weathering, erosion and use of fertilizer becomes dissolved phosphate ions within ocean, lakes and soil. And equally through sedimentation, that process is reversed. That could be absorbed into plants to become incorporated into their biomass. Those phosphate ions would pass into animals through feeding. So that phosphorus is now incorporated in the animal. Through excretion, it can be released back into dissolved phosphate ion form, PO43-, into oceans or lakes, so waterways and soil. And excretion decomposition will ultimately put phosphate back into, or phosphate ions more specifically, into waste and remains that either could be eroded and will bring us back into that dissolved phosphate ions, or through a process of deposition, as you've got at the bottom, can be incorporated back into rock. Now, one really important final thing just to say about all of this is something to do with mycorrhizal fungi. I'm just going to put the word up at the top. So the thing that I'm just going to speak about now is something called mycorrhizal fungi, and it's just something to be aware of, especially if you're doing the AQA syllabus. They're fungi that have what's called a mutualistic association with the roots of plants, and they form an extension designed to increase the surface area for the absorption of water via osmosis, but it also acts like a sponge to hold water. And what it does is help not only avoid it, or help it to avoid drought, but it makes it easier to take up ions such as phosphates. So we're more specifically talking about plants here in this section of the phosphorus cycle, but it's just something to be aware of, that you can have this mycorrhizal fungi which have a mutualistic association with roots and ultimately will help take up those phosphate ions from the soil and from waterways. Now that's an extra bit that is in the AQA scheme of work. Okay, hope all that helps.